From the savage raids of Mongol invaders to the iron-fisted grip of modern presidents, Russia's journey is one of blood, brilliance, betrayal, and breathtaking change. This gripping documentary traces the evolution of Russia across centuries, from the medieval princes of Kievan Rus, through the czars and revolutionaries to the Kremlin rulers of today. Prepare to uncover secrets history forgot, witness the collapse of empires, and understand how one nation's rise has repeatedly ended in ruin, only to rise again. If you've ever wondered why Russia is the way it is, this is your ultimate historical journey. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more deep dives into history's darkest corners. Imagine a land of endless forests, frozen rivers, and scattered tribes. No Kremlin, no Moscow, no empire, just survival. This was Russia before it was Russia. Out of the mists of the 9th century rose a federation of Slavic tribes ruled by Norse warriors, men known as the Rus. They didn't just raid, they ruled, eventually founding a city that would echo through time: Kyiv. Kievan Rus was a trade hub, a cultural melting pot, and the birthplace of Orthodox Christianity in the Slavic world. In 988, Prince Vladimir's dramatic baptism in the Dnieper River wasn't just spiritual, it was political. He tied his people to Byzantium, absorbing its grandeur, writing systems, and gods. It was the first moment of Russian statecraft, and it came not through war, but through religion and strategic diplomacy. But the rise of Kievan Rus was built on fragile alliances, tribal loyalty, and a tenuous chain of succession. The unity didn't last. As princes quarreled and rivals multiplied, the region fractured. Internal conflict eroded the foundation of power, and like so many empires to come, the collapse didn't come from outside, at least not at first. Then came thunder from the east. In 1237, the Mongols descended like a biblical plague. Cities were burned. Princes were executed. The grand city of Kyiv was reduced to ash. The invincible warriors of the steppe didn't just conquer. They owned the Russian lands for over 200 years. They called it the Tatar yoke. But it was more than domination. It reshaped Russia's identity. The Mongols didn't care about culture, just tribute and control. They let local rulers exist, but only as long as they bowed and paid in silver, blood, and obedience. This submission to brutal authority had consequences. It wasn't just a historical footnote, it altered the very DNA of Russian governance. Under Mongol rule, Muscovy began to rise, quietly collecting power, wealth, and favor from their overlords. Where Kyiv had been the cradle, Moscow was the teenager, watching, learning, and preparing. Russia's birth wasn't a clean moment in time. It was forged in the fires of war, faith, and foreign domination. From the Norse traders to Byzantine priests to Mongol khans, every outsider left their mark. And from the ashes of Kyiv, a new center of power began to smolder, one that would one day challenge empires. The ashes of Mongol domination birthed a new empire, and its capital was no longer Kyiv, but Moscow. The city, once a minor post, had mastered the politics of survival. While other regions resisted the Mongols and burned, Moscow cooperated, collected taxes, and grew rich. It became the chosen seat of power, the nucleus of a new Russian identity. And then came a boy who would change history forever, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. At just 3 years old, Ivan inherited a throne soaked in blood. His father was poisoned, his mother likely murdered. Raised among cruel nobles and courtly backstabbing, Ivan learned young that power wasn't inherited, it was seized. When he was crowned in 1547, he didn't just call himself Grand Prince. He chose a new title, Tsar of all Rus. For the first time, a Russian ruler claimed absolute power with divine sanction. He was no longer a prince, he was an emperor. And his rule? It was revolutionary and terrifying. Ivan was a genius reformer and a brutal tyrant. He modernized the military, centralized laws, and reduced the influence of boyars, the powerful noble class. But paranoia consumed him. After his beloved wife Anastasia died, likely poisoned, something inside him snapped. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that unleashed a reign of terror. Entire cities were massacred. His own son, the heir to the throne, was murdered by his hands in a fit of rage. The Tsar had become a madman. But Ivan's cruelty had purpose. It planted the roots of a political tradition that still haunts Russia. The idea that order must come through fear, that unity demands the destruction of opposition. Ivan believed Russia needed a strong hand, and he would be the iron fist. Through violence and terror, he expanded the Russian territory to Siberia, transforming a regional kingdom into a continental empire. After Ivan's death, Russia plunged into chaos. Literally, the time of troubles saw famine, invasion, and civil war. Foreign armies occupied Moscow, pretenders claimed the throne. For nearly 2 decades, the country unraveled. And just when it seemed Russia might vanish from the map, the Romanovs emerged, an obscure noble family hand-picked by the people to restore order. Ivan's legacy lived on. The Romanovs didn't forget what the first Tsar had shown them. Power in Russia isn't given, it's taken, protected, and when necessary, enforced with blood. The monarchy would endure and even flourish, but the seeds of authoritarianism planted by Ivan's hand were now embedded deep in the soul of the Russian state. When Mikhail Romanov was crowned Tsar in 1613, Russia was on the verge of collapse. But what followed was a masterclass in political rebirth. The Romanovs would rule for over 300 years, transforming Russia from a fractured, famine-ridden state into a European superpower. Or so it seemed. Behind the palaces and portraits lay a fragile empire, held together by myth, fear, and brutality. Early Romanovs focused on stability, but it was Peter the Great who would ignite transformation. Towering, ruthless, and obsessed with Western Europe, Peter dragged Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. He shaved beards, built a navy, created a new capital, St. Petersburg, and even imposed Western dress codes. Russia had always looked eastward. Now it looked west, but progress came at a price. Peter taxed his people to the brink, conscripted them by force, and turned modernization into militarization. The new Russia was not one of freedom or enlightenment. It was a machine. A Europeanized empire on the outside, but feudal and brutal beneath. For every palace built, thousands died in the mud. For every reform passed, a peasant bled to fund it. The Romanovs ruled with divine authority. The Tsar was not just king, he was God's representative on earth. Dissent wasn't political, it was heresy. And while the nobility feasted, the peasantry starved. Serfdom, the institutional slavery of millions, was the backbone of Romanov wealth. This contradiction would fester for centuries, poisoning any illusion of national unity. Fast forward to Catherine the Great, the empress who expanded the empire, reformed the law, and charmed Enlightenment thinkers, while brutally crushing revolts and reinforcing aristocratic dominance. She wrote letters to Voltaire while her Cossacks whipped peasants into submission. Russia's identity became schizophrenic, progressive in words, oppressive in practice, and so the illusion continued. The empire grew, the court dazzled, and czars declared themselves fathers of the nation. But the people, the real people, lived in crushing poverty. Industrialization was slow, education was limited. The divide between the elites and everyone else wasn't just wide, it was dangerous. By the late 19th century, the world was changing fast. Empires were adapting or collapsing. But Russia remained frozen in time, ruled by an absolute monarch blind to the storm ahead. The Romanovs had built a glittering facade, but beneath it the foundations were cracking. The revolution was no longer a question of if, but when. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Romanovs still lived like gods, but their empire was rotting. Russian peasants made up over 80% of the population, yet lived like medieval serfs. Factory workers toiled in hellish conditions for starvation wages, and the ruling elite, blinded by palaces, pearls, and prophecy. They didn't see it coming, but revolution was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. In 1905, after peaceful protesters marched to the Tsar's winter palace, soldiers opened fire. Hundreds were killed. The world would know it as Bloody Sunday. For the first time, the Russian people realized the Tsar was not their protector. He was their executioner. The seeds of rebellion took root in blood-soaked snow. Then came World War I, a disaster for Russia. Ill-equipped, poorly led, and catastrophically managed, the Russian army lost millions. Morale collapsed. Cities ran out of food. And the Tsar, Nicholas II, left the capital to lead the army, leaving power in the hands of his wife, Alexandra, and her mystic advisor, Rasputin, a man the nobility despised and the public feared. The Romanov image, already tarnished, began to rot. In 1917, it all broke. Massive strikes, mutinying soldiers, and public fury forced Nicholas to abdicate. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a resignation. Russia became a republic, briefly, but one man saw a greater opportunity: Vladimir Lenin. Exiled, radical, and brilliant, Lenin believed that Russia didn't need democracy, it needed revolution. He returned to Petrograd with German help, promising peace, bread, and land. His Bolsheviks were a minority, but they were organized, armed, and relentless. In October 1917, they seized power in a near-bloodless coup. The world had changed overnight. The Soviet Union was born not as a people's paradise, but as a one-party state. Lenin dissolved the elected assembly after one meeting. Opposition was crushed. Land was taken. Factories were seized. And while Lenin preached liberation, he unleashed the Red Terror, mass arrests, executions, and civil war. Russia was at war with itself. Lenin's rise wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a total system reset. Religion was banned, property was abolished, the calendar was rewritten, history itself was edited. Russia, now the USSR, became the first nation to claim a workers' utopia, built not with ballots but with bullets. Lenin would die in 1924, leaving behind a power vacuum. But even in death, he became a symbol, embalmed and put on display like a saint. The man who promised equality had created a state more centralized, more authoritarian, and more obsessed with control than the Tsars ever were. And waiting in the wings, a man far more ruthless than Lenin could ever imagine. When Lenin died, there was no clear successor, but one man, quiet, calculating, and underestimated, was already weaving his web. Joseph Stalin, once a minor revolutionary from Georgia, became General Secretary of the Communist Party. A bureaucratic role? On paper, yes. In reality, it was a trapdoor into absolute power. Stalin didn't seize control overnight. He manipulated it into his hands, piece by piece. He outmaneuvered rivals like Trotsky, who was charismatic but naive. Stalin used lies, alliances, and bureaucracy as weapons. By 1929, he had eliminated or exiled every competitor. The revolution that had promised equality was now in the grip of a single man, one colder than winter and harder than steel. Stalin launched a campaign of forced modernization. His 5-year plans aimed to transform a rural peasant economy into an industrial titan. The cost? unimaginable. Entire villages were emptied. Millions were herded into collective farms. Resistance was met with famine, especially in Ukraine, where the Holodomor killed millions. It wasn't just poor policy, it was punishment. But Stalin wasn't done. He turned paranoia into policy. The Great Purge saw hundreds of thousands executed, party members, generals, scientists, even his closest allies. The gulags overflowed with writers, teachers, and workers accused of treason. The people didn't just fear the state, they feared their neighbors. And yet, under Stalin's grip, the USSR industrialized at lightning speed. Cities rose, tanks rolled, steel poured from Soviet foundries. When Hitler invaded in 1941, expecting an easy victory, he met something else. A people brutalized, hardened, and capable of unthinkable sacrifice. Over 20 million Soviets died in World War II. Entire cities were annihilated, but when the smoke cleared, the red flag flew over Berlin. Stalin emerged a victor, but not a liberator. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. The Iron Curtain descended. In the West, Stalin was both admired and feared. In the East, he was a god and a ghost. He remade Russia into a superpower. But at what cost? Every factory was built on graves. Every victory echoed with screams. Even in death in 1953, Stalin's shadow loomed. His body was embalmed next to Lenin's. His cult of personality had reached divine heights, but the poison of his rule would linger. His successors would attempt to reform, to thaw the frost he left behind. But the foundations of fear and obedience remained. The Soviet Union had become a global titan, but inside, the cracks were spreading. The empire Stalin built would one day collapse under its own weight. Stalin was gone, but the system he forged endured. His death in 1953 sparked a power shuffle, and eventually, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader. He shocked the world in 1956 by publicly denouncing Stalin's crimes, calling them a cult of personality. For the first time, the Iron Mask cracked. But reform wasn't revolution. The Soviet machine kept rolling, only now it had a new opponent, the United States. The Cold War wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with ideology, spies, and nuclear threats. Both superpowers built arsenals that could annihilate the world 10 times over. The space race became a cosmic competition. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. In 1961, they put Yuri Gagarin in space. The USSR was winning at first, but domestically, the system was stalling. The economy, centrally planned and rigid, couldn't compete with the innovation-driven West. Factories kept producing, but quality plummeted. Supermarkets had shelves, but no food. Lines stretched for blocks. Innovation was dangerous, conformity was safe. Corruption became the true currency of survival. Then came Leonid Brezhnev, a man of stability and stagnation. Under him, the USSR maintained its image of strength, but the cracks deepened. Dissent was crushed. Writers were exiled. But the people were tired of empty promises, failing systems, and lives stuck in cement. In the 1980s, the unexpected happened. A young, energetic leader rose, Mikhail Gorbachev. With him came two words that shook the Soviet foundations: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Gorbachev wanted to save socialism by reforming it, but instead, he unleashed forces no one could control. As censorship lifted, the truth flooded in. Citizens learned about Stalin's purges, the Gulag horrors, and the lies they had been fed. Nationalist movements erupted across the republics. The Baltic states wanted independence. Ukraine stirred. Georgia rebelled. Even in Moscow, protests grew. Then came Chernobyl, the 1986 nuclear disaster that the Soviet government tried to hide. But the lies unraveled fast, exposing the incompetence and deception at the heart of the regime. It wasn't just a meltdown of a reactor, it was a meltdown of credibility. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern Europe, once locked in Soviet chains, broke free. And in 1991, after a failed coup by hardline communists, the unthinkable happened. Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet Union, once one of the two great powers on Earth, ceased to exist. 15 republics emerged. The hammer and sickle was lowered for the last time. The empire that promised utopia had collapsed, not in flames but in silence. And in the rubble, a new Russia was born, lost, chaotic, and vulnerable. Waiting in the wings? Opportunists, oligarchs, and one man who would turn it all to his advantage. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian people didn't celebrate. They panicked. Their world vanished overnight. One currency disappeared. Food prices exploded. Savings were wiped out, and basic necessities vanished from stores. Democracy was promised, but what came next was chaos. At the helm of the new Russian Federation stood a man many saw as a hero of reform, Boris Yeltsin. But history would remember him very differently. Yeltsin embraced Western-style capitalism almost overnight. But Russia had no middle class, no market institutions, and no safeguards. What followed was the most radical privatization experiment in history. State industries, oil, gas, media, banks, were sold off for pennies. Who bought them? A small group of connected men who became billionaires almost instantly, the oligarchs. Meanwhile, average Russians sank into poverty. Life expectancy dropped. Organized crime skyrocketed. Armed gangs replaced government oversight. Corruption wasn't a side effect, it became the system. People who once feared the KGB now feared their landlords, their bosses, and their neighbors. It was the wild, lawless East. Yeltsin, once a populist reformer, became a symbol of incompetence and drunkenness. His televised speeches slurred, his decisions erratic. The country teetered on collapse. In 1993, he even shelled his own parliament building to crush dissent. Russian democracy was dying in infancy. By the late 1990s, Russia was exhausted. Then, in 1999, Yeltsin made one last decision, perhaps the most consequential of his life. He handed the presidency to a little-known former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin. Few had heard of him. He was quiet, cold, and loyal, but he moved fast. Putin promised stability. He crushed the Chechen rebellion with brutal force, restored pride in the military, and reasserted Moscow's control. The oligarchs who defied him, exiled, jailed, silenced. The rest bowed. Order had returned, but so had fear. Under Putin, the media was tamed. Elections became predictable, opposition voices disappeared, and behind the scenes, a new elite emerged. Not ideological communists, but loyal technocrats and intelligence officers, the so-called Siloviki. They didn't argue over ideas. They executed strategies. By the early 2000s, Putin wasn't just a president, he was a phenomenon. His image, shirtless on a horse, diving into frozen lakes, lecturing Western leaders, was cultivated like a brand. For many Russians, he represented strength, control, and rebirth. After years of humiliation, he gave them something to believe in. But beneath the surface, Russia was changing. Power was no longer shared. It was personalized. Laws were rewritten. Terms were extended. Critics like Anna Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov were assassinated. The line between state and individual blurred. Russia had moved past democracy, and many didn't even notice. The Soviet Union had fallen. But in its place, a new kind of autocracy was rising, smarter, sleeker, and built to last. All it needed was a narrative, a villain, a cause. And soon the world would give Putin exactly that. At the start of the 21st century, Russia rebranded itself as a modern state, capitalist, confident, and powerful. Skyscrapers rose in Moscow, luxury cars lined the streets, Western companies flooded in, but behind the scenes, the real architecture was invisible, built not of steel or glass, but of surveillance, fear, and loyalty. Under Vladimir Putin, the state was no longer just a government, it was an organism. The Kremlin controlled the courts, the media, and the money. Elections were held, but outcomes were never in doubt. The internet was monitored, protests were crushed. Dissent wasn't banned, it was buried. Propaganda became a science. State-run media didn't just tell Russians what to think, it told them what to feel. Enemies were everywhere. NATO, the West, internal traitors. Patriotism wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. Soviet nostalgia surged. Stalin's image was rehabilitated. School books were rewritten. Truth became optional. Then came the invasion of Crimea in 2014. It wasn't just a land grab, it was a message. Russia would no longer play by post-Cold War rules. Inside Russia, Putin's approval soared. Outside, sanctions hit. But Putin had something more powerful than oil or tanks, a population conditioned to see conflict as pride and isolation as strength. As Putin's grip tightened, his term limits dissolved. He rewrote the constitution, ensuring he could rule into the 2030s. Opponents were poisoned abroad, jailed at home, or simply vanished. One by one, the lights of free speech dimmed. Alexei Navalny, the most prominent opposition figure, became a symbol of defiance and repression. Then, in 2022, Putin launched a full-scale war on Ukraine. He called it a special military operation, but the world knew better. Cities were bombed, civilians killed. Russia became a global pariah almost overnight. But inside the country, state media told a different story. Russia was the victim. The West was corrupt. This war was not conquest, it was survival. But wars have a cost. The Russian economy strained. Young men fled the draft. The myth of invincibility began to crack. The facade of stability was dented by reality. And once again, as in the days of the Tsars and the Soviets, Russia stood at a crossroads, torn between pride and truth, power and collapse. The arc of Russian history is not a straight line. It rises and falls, repeats and reinvents. From the princes of Kiev to the paranoia of Stalin, from czars in gilded halls to presidents with nuclear codes, the pattern is clear. Power is won, held, and defended at all costs. But empires built on fear eventually crumble. And so the question isn't whether Russia will rise or fall again. The question is, who will pay the price next time?